off in a distant land, there lived a lady. And this lady was very bright and very intelligent and very brave. And this lady had grown up in this small village. She'd been a great community member. She'd done everything she could to help the community. And she'd also tried her best to learn everything that the people in the community could offer her. But as she grew, she had a thirst for deeper understanding, a thirst to find out more about the world. So she decided that she would leave the village and head off to look for greater wisdom. So she bid farewell to all of her friends and her family, and she packed her things together and she set off. And she walked for days and days until she came to a big city. But this city had huge stone walls all around it. She thought it was unusual, but she was curious. So she went up to the walls and she knocked on the big gates and she went in. And she began to wander around in the city. And it was a lovely city. The people there had everything that they needed. And she thought it would be a great place to stay and learn. But there was one thing which didn't seem right. Everybody that she spoke to seemed very, very worried and very, very anxious. She couldn't quite put her finger on why. So she went up to a man and she said, "I've come here to learn and gain wisdom, but I'm afraid that I won't be able to because everybody is very, very worried and very, very anxious. Why?" And the man said, "Oh, you have come here on the worst possible day. This is the day that the giant arrives." Now the lady, very, very interested in what this man had to say. You see, all of her life she thought that giants didn't exist. So she said, "And tell me more about the giant." And the man went on. He said, "On this day, every year, a great giant appears in the distance on the hills. And it calls for us to send out a warrior to fight the giant. And it tells us that if we don't, he will knock down the city walls and crush us all." The woman said, "Okay, and how's it gone? How have the warriors managed?" The man said, "Every year, the warrior goes out. They look at the giant and they are stunned. They can't move and the giant crushes them in their place." Now the woman really, really wanted to see this giant. She was still a little bit sceptical and thought maybe this giant didn't even exist. So she said to the man, can I see the giant?" The man said, "The only way you can see the giant is by going out there as the warrior." So the woman thought for a moment. She nodded her head. She said, "Then I shall go." And they waited behind the city walls. And it wasn't long before, in the distance, they heard the sound of footsteps. And then the call of, "Send out your warrior, or I will knock down your city walls and crush you all." It was the giant. The lady stepped out. And there was an incline all the way up to the hills. And she stood there. She looked into the distance. And there in the distance, she could see the silhouette of the giant. But she could only see up to its waist. Even up to its waist, it looked huge. 12, 15 feet high. She took a deep breath. She wanted to turn and run back inside. But she'd given her word to the people. She'd given her word to herself. So instead of turning and running, She took a step forward and another step. And slowly she walked towards the giant, and she noticed that the giant started walking towards her too. And something started to happen. As she walked up and her perspective of the giant changed, she could see its whole body, from its feet to the top of its head. And it wasn't 12 or 15 feet after all. It now looked about 10 feet. So she continued to walk, and the giant continued to get closer. And now it was about 8 feet. As it got smaller, she picked up her pace, and she began to run towards it. And as she ran towards it, it got smaller and smaller. It was now only 6 feet tall. She began to feel better about herself. Even if she was going to be crushed by this thing, at least she knew what it was. It was no longer some big thing that was out of control that she had no idea about. So she picked up her pace again, until eventually she was running. And she ran straight to the giant, and the giant was running straight at her. And they kept going until they met each other, toe to toe. And the giant was no longer 15 foot, or 10 foot, or 6 foot, or 4 foot. Now the giant was no longer than 12 inches tall. And he was continuing to shrink. She picked him up and she held him in his hand and watched as he got smaller and smaller and smaller. She only had time to ask him one quick question. She looked him in the eyes and said, "Who are you?" The giant looked back and said, "All around the world I have different names. But to you and your people, I am simply known as Fear." And with that, he shrank to the size of a grain of sand and was blown away by the wind. And the lady stood there. She'd left her small village in the search for wisdom. And on that day, she received the greatest lesson. That often our fears are bigger than we think. And the only way to overcome them is to go towards them. And with each step we take, they become smaller and smaller, until finally we know that we can control them and hold them in our hand. So I hope you liked that story, Facing the Giant, a story about fear and overcoming our fears.